Hello and welcome to session 295 in the AISafety.com reading group. Tonight we will be discussing California Senate Bill 1047 by Senator Scott Wiener and others. The bill is actually called Safe and Secure Innovation for Frontier Artificial Intelligence Models Act. And this was changed in one of the later amendments. It used to be systems instead of models. It's introduced by Senator Scott Wiener with several other Democratic co-authors in California. It was placed on Legiscan on the 20th of March, but it's actually somewhat a tiny bit older. We're on the fifth version, and the status was read second time, ordered to third reading, but it seems it's been ordered to assembly now with a rather large vote. So it appears it is progressing. Will it actually become law this session? This market resolves on the September the 2nd, so probably before around like the end of August. Currently it's a coin toss. My intuition is that it's better. I would probably buy this prediction market, but I'm of course not a lawyer and I know very little about the Californian assembly and legislative system. So one thing I did do is to look up all the amendments, the changes that has been to this bill, and a lot of it looks really good, a lot of tightening up of formulation, but also a couple of noteworthy amendments that I will highlight here. The bill starts out with a relatively standard introduction with general text about the dangers and promise from AI, as you would expect. I noticed they say it can be used for wildfire prevention, which I thought was like a very Californian thing to highlight. It also writes a bit about the threats from AI, talking about things like weapons of mass destruction that can be like built with AI. It doesn't precisely identify the threat from power-seeking AI, but I think it's reasonably good. Somewhat more contentiously, it states that the state government has an essential role to play in avoiding the most severe risks. That's not at all obvious that this is something that the state government should do, and I actually found a statement by Senator Scott Wiener where he says this actually belongs at the congressional level, but they need to get ahead of Congress to maintain trust. In theory, I will take what we can get in the AI safety movement, so this isn't a big problem for us. How beneficial this actually is in fact a pretty difficult question to answer. I don't have a strong intuition about this. The bill itself starts out with a number of definitions. They define all of these, and as far as I can tell, most of it is pretty good. Like, you can quibble that the definition of artificial intelligence doesn't talk about like learning or training, but in general, most of this is really good. I'm very happy with that. There are four things I want to highlight. First is on the covered guidance. It's defined mostly as industry best practice. And I think this could be a mistake, because if you imagine that there are 4 developers of frontier models and none of them have a clue about how to make it safe, then just looking at the other 3s won't actually give you much safety. And because I expect this is how it's actually going to fail in practice, then I think this is a big deal. The second is the definition of a derivative model. It's a derivative model if it's not independently trained. And I think this is a potential problem in that it assumes that compute is a central constraint in training these models. It could be algorithms, it could be data, hyperparameters, many different things. And also, because developers want to be derivative, it's very easy to say it's that, oh, my model is not independently trained, right? You can just literally start with an existing model and then use a huge amount of extra compute on top of that. And then it's obviously an independently trained model, but not according to this definition. There's a definition of a full shutdown, which is a shutdown everywhere you control. I recognize they needed to make this definition very lax to not be to not restrict open source too much. But I think like if the model has literally escaped from your control, then you should be on the hook. It's a kind of silly loophole to me. when they define hazardous capabilities, they talk about things that are as dangerous as weapons of mass destruction and damages that are more than $500 million. I think it's okay, but I would prefer Bostrom 6 strategic domains to be, because that's the thing that we are actually worried about. There is one definition that needs to be talked about at length, and that is a limited duty exemption. In the original version of the bill, it was a positive safety evaluation. And I think limited duty exemption is a far better name in explaining what this actually is. So we're talking about a covered model, meaning something that is GPT-4 or at least GPT-4, probably GPT-5, around this level. It can't be a derivative model, and if in some way the developer can conclude that it's not even close to being dangerous, then this means that this is almost all models in practice. You're going to be able to get a limited duty exemption in almost all cases, and that's going to give this bill a lot of supporters. So even though this isn't technically relevant to AI safety, I really want to highlight this because I think this is something where the bill can get a lot of political support. So I think this is really valuable. They also say that you can only get a limited duty exemption if the model also can't easily be made into a dangerous model, like by fine-tuning or giving access to something else. And I think we have these two definitions of something that is post-training and something that is a derivative model. I think in my model these two things are the same concept, but the bill doesn't contain a link between these two things. So if you have a model and you believe it's not on the frontier, what should you do when you train that? Well, before you start to train the model, you should try to figure out, is this on the frontier or will I be able to get a limited duty exemption? And I think this is pretty cool that you require people to pre-register before they train the model. But of course, if you pre-register and you don't actually tell anyone, then that seems kind of fishy, right? You need to at least write it down. I don't know to what extent people can just make up the fact that they wrote this 3 months ago or something like that. I don't know if that's a possibility. So you will get a limited duty exemption if it's lower in common benchmarks and doesn't have greater capability than a model that already has a limited duty exemption. So this means that unless you are on the frontier, you can basically just train it, and if there's a limited duty exemption, you have to do basically nothing. It may be that you train the model, you believe your model will not be on the frontier, and you train it and it turns out, whoops, it is actually really, really good, much better than you expected. Well, good faith errors are accepted. You just need to report within 30 days and cease operating. It doesn't actually say if you can cease, if you can operate for 30 days and then you cease. I would focus a bit more on the fact that they explicitly write that good faith errors are accepted, because I think in general that is the case, but by highlighting this in this extremely explicit way, it creates some kind of bad culture. Like in many other cases, like if you do critical things, then you don't get this kind of emphasis on the fact that we accept good faith errors. Okay, but let's say you are training a model and you believe this might in fact be the best model ever. It's something where you can't get a limited duty model. This is, for as far as I can see, something that right now only 4 companies can do, and it's probably something that's going to cost at least $1 billion. So in this case, what the bill mostly does is it requires you to document a few things, and then it requires you to also do some common sense safety things. And I think the paperwork is really, really light. Like if you're paying $1 billion for something, then filling out some forms is pretty reasonable. In particular, compared to the object level, where you have to make that safe, and that's probably going to be dramatically harder. So you can't train a non-limited duty model that is greater than 10 to the 26 flops, which is between GPT-4 and GPT-5, I would guess. You need to make sure it's protected against theft and misuse and a number of other things, including escape, that is appropriate in light of the risks. And you need to have the capability to shut it down, and you need to describe this. You need to have a safety and a security protocol that is reasonable. So all of this relates to the risks, and I think this is really good. You also need to specify both the tests you're gonna run and what results you expect, and account for third-party fine-tuning. You need to designate someone as responsible, and you should ensure that you can attribute the actions of the model to it. And again, they say to the extent reasonably possible. Like if it like kills a lot of people, then you should totally be able to do this. All this is done under threat of perjury, which sounded really impressive when I read about it, but it turns out that perjury is almost never punished, according to Zvi Mowshowitz, which means that this kind of requirement might be a lot less, might have a lot less teeth than what we would expect. Okay, you have trained a model and you expect it to be more powerful, and what are your obligations when you are training it and when you're deploying it? So Zvi Mowshowitz on the first reading of the bill commented that, like, could you deploy it at all? And this bill certainly does not prevent you from deploying models that could be catastrophically dangerous. They also say that you can't just assume you're going to get a limited duty exemption. If it's not reasonable, then you still have to follow some requirements. And I think that's a bit unclear to me, because the limited duty exemptions already had to be reasonable. Maybe there's something like a possibly limited duty exemption model. I'm a bit confused about how the law is going to work at this stage. So you need to have an annual certification. That's one thing. Every time there is a safety incident, you need to report it promptly. You need to take into account reasonably foreseeable risks of harm and reasonably foreseeable weaknesses in capability testing. So this is like the key word here is reasonable foreseeable, and that's defined as something that's been identified by the other frontier model developers, the Frontier Model Division, which we'll get to in just a moment, and the capability testing organization that they cite. So this means that we have a specific pipeline of threats that we need to go through. Like if you find some argument for some risk of harm, then you need to convince a capability testing organization that will then report to the Frontier Model Division. And at that point, the people who are deploying these models need to take them into account. One thing that is not added here that I really thought should be added is strict liability. Like if you are doing something and you are very well aware that it is very dangerous, then strict liability seems like a really, really obvious thing to have at this point. You have that a lot in like product law, and my understanding would be that this is very reasonable, but the bill does not say this. The bill also gives obligations to operators of computer clusters. First, they need to identify the person behind the customer. It doesn't consider the case where it's an AI that is in fact rendering the computer cluster. And you need to assess whether a prospective customer intends to utilize the computing cluster to deploy a covered model. And then here, we're talking about deployment, and in some of the other description they're talking about the training of models. And it's not clear whether we are talking of training and deployment, and I think the bill is actually containing a mistake at this point. I tried to tweet Senator Scott Wiener about this, but unfortunately it got caught in some blogging filter in Twitter, so I couldn't actually tweet this to him. Computer cluster operators also need to implement the capability to promptly enact a full shutdown in the case of an emergency. And I think that's good, but something that you obviously need to practice. I do think that this falls substantially short of this classic know your customer that banks, etc. have to deal with. Because you could like have a a stooge, or I don't actually know what the term is, but some kind of straw man who is hiring the computer cluster, who's actually not the one calling the shots. And this bill doesn't seem to do anything to prevent that. Next part of the bill is something that there should be equitable access to these models. I think this is basically a distraction. Now we get to the part of enforcement. What happens if you fail to do these things? First is that it's the Attorney General who should bring the suit. And I think this is in fact a significant limitation. I don't know enough about the Californian legal system to be really sure, but I think this is in fact a substantial limitation. The next is the fees, like 10% of the compute price and 30% for repeat offenders, which I think is like really, really weak. I would imagine that many, like something like OpenAI would definitely be able to eat this kind of cost, and so would Google and Microsoft. If the court deems this appropriate, then it can order a full shutdown of the model. The court, as far as I can tell, can't disallow Google from just training a new model, unfortunately. If there is an imminent risk of a catastrophe, then preventative relief is a possibility, which I think is really nice. But I also think that if something like this happens, I would expect people to go to jail, and the bill very explicitly does not allow for this. They also say about talk about whether there's like a corporate structure, like something like both Google have a complicated corporate structure, and so does OpenAI. And if this prevents them from like getting this fee, then they impose joint and several liability. I don't actually know what that means. That does sound really tough, but then again, the fees are really, really small, so it may not be that big of a deal. And also, one thing that was added in the in one of the amendments was that you don't actually get these punishments on the first year, and the second year you get some fees. By 2026, this bill will be totally in force, and you will get all of this. I think I have so short timelines that this is a substantial issue for me. I think this is a reasonable compromise. Then there's the whistleblower protection, that if someone believes that these rules are not being followed, then they can tell the Attorney General, and they can retaliate afterwards. And I think this is really impactful, as this is something that OpenAI seem to fear a lot and put a lot of effort into preventing. I think they can do too much of this already, and I would be very happy with this, so we don't get something like David could tell you again. And there are some other things that they should do for whistleblower protection. I think this is basically something that should be present everywhere, but in particular everywhere where you have dangerous capabilities. I'm pretty happy about that. I think also non-disparagement, in particular secret non-disparagement contracts, should be illegal, but that's outside the scope of this. The Frontier Model Division is hereby created. We've been alluding to it previously, and that's an institution that should release the findings from these annual certification reports, issue guidance on how to prevent risks from these models, have an optional accreditation process. It unfortunately became optional in the some of the amendments. Publish the anonymized AI safety incident reports. It was planned that they should establish a confidential forum for sharing best practices amongst the frontier model developers, but that got taken out in some of the amendments. Describe what's an emergency, do an advisory committee for open source AI, which seems strange and unlikely to be impactful. Develop model jury instructions, issue technical guidance regarding the thresholds on the benchmarks for what counts as a covered model and what counts as a limited duty exemption, and then compare with other developers on how good these precautions are. One of the things that I noticed very much is that the law is meant to be interpreted to have similar thresholds as used in federal law for the management of hazardous capabilities. I think this is central and could potentially be really tough. Like if you want to have the same kind of security standard that you have in a nuclear power plant in OpenAI, then that is going to like dramatically change how OpenAI works. Finally, the last part of the bill establishes Cal compute, which I unfortunately also think is a distraction. So what are my overall conclusions? My overall conclusions is that this is a pretty good bill. It's well crafted and a lot more than I had expected. It is unfortunately also falling quite a bit short of what it would take to not be killed by these models. But I think this is the kind of thing that lowers my PDOOM, and if it is in fact passed in over all this lobbying, then that will lower my PDOOM even more. I did not like the fact that there is so much preemptive talk that if you make mistakes, then that is perfectly alright. If you're doing something really dangerous, the presumption should be that you are like mature and professional and like worthy of this kind of responsibility. This is in particular important because I expect that the way this bill is going to fail in practice is that the object level requirements of like ensuring the model is safe will turn out to be something that they just can't do. And in that case, so what is a reasonable error becomes much more important. I also really like that this bill basically assumes that the models will be jailbroken. I think this is a really good idea. It doesn't talk about liability very much. It explicitly does not have strict liability, and it's unclear if there is even normal liability. Like if you make a model and it causes $1 billion in damages, is OpenAI on the hook for that? I think you could argue that this like provides a safe haven for OpenAI, that they can say, oh, they're not liable because they followed all these instructions. And in that case, the bill would have been counterproductive. I do think that one explicit thing that's going to happen from this bill is Meta has previously open sourced the model weights from some of their models, and I think this is the kind of thing that's going to be a lot tougher to do if this bill is passed. So that will be a positive effect of this bill. That is all for today. Thank you and see you next time.